Okay, so he's got this little gun with actually a pretty good kick on it. And he waits until there's because everyone knows the play really well.
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln, I think, had seen it before. Booth knew it because he was an actor. He'd probably been in it a few
He
times.
probably rehearsed for the role because I
Right.
thought he was supposed to perform that night too.
No, he was not to perform. I've never heard that.
Or is he supposed to have worked backstage? I'm confused.
No, he was a star.
I know, but wasn't he involved in the production somehow?
I don't know anything about that, but he was an actor and well known, so he would be normal to be hanging around a theater. So I don't know if he had anything to do with that. So I never heard that before. But he waits while in the play while it's going for there to be a big laugh line. Everybody's laughing to kind of muffle the sound of the shot. He leans in, he shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. Rathbone sees it and jumps up. The Lincoln's guest, Major Rathbone, jumps up to try and stop him. He pulls a knife, slashes Rathbone's arm pretty badly. Then decides, because this is an actor who knows how to make an exit, does a flying leap out of the presidential box onto the stage. However, he's wearing riding spurs, and those trip him up on the flags that were draped around the presidential box, so he kind of breaks his leg when he lands.
But even though he broke his leg, he did manage to evade authorities for quite a while.
No, we're not even to that. He managed to stand up and yell either "the South is avenged, thus ever to tyrants," maybe in English, maybe in Latin, where a lot of confusion about it. Then hobbles out to where he's got a stagehand whose name totally blanks me right now, holding his horse, and he hops on the horse and rides off and is able to get, be able to make good his escape. He hooks up with David Harold, and the two of them go riding through the darkness into the wilderness of Virginia. And then they go to the, eventually they end up there trying to get to Virginia from Maryland. Okay, it's not that bad of a run.
Okay.
Not unreasonable, even in the middle of the night. But eventually they end up at the house of a guy named Samuel Mudd. He's a doctor. Dr. Mudd basically sets Booth's leg, pardon me, puts it in a splint and sends him on his way. Later on, he says, gives him some supplies also. Later on, he says he had no idea who Booth was. But Sarah Vowell in her Assassination Vacation book makes a wonderful point that she could barely find the place with a map and a GPS. So the idea that Booth didn't know where that was, he had to know where it was.
Yeah.
Anyway.
There was no way he could have gone there unless someone had drawn it on a map for him.
Like I said, even with maps at night without lights.
Oh, yeah. He'd have had to have done a practice run a time or two to get
He'd have to know that territory just a little bit. So he eventually gets away far enough. He's in a tobacco hiding barn, a tobacco drying barn, excuse me. This is Virginia, the home of RJR and Philip Morris and all those. And so he's actually, I believe he'd crossed over at Port Tobacco. So now we've gone from the alcoholic part to the tobacco part of the assassination.
Oh.
So he's in there and is eventually surrounded by soldiers, and is the guy who's with him, David Harold, comes out and surrenders. Booth writes a long letter to his mother, gives it to Harold, I think. I've somehow got it out of there. Then shot himself in the neck, not the head, in the neck. So he didn't die for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, they ran in and pulled him out. He was for several hours totally paralyzed. So he's brought out, and that's how Booth dies. So they don't have Booth to try anymore. So then they do the trial of the other four people who are brought up in this. And again, this is all trying to point it towards a Confederate. This trial was very rigged. And I don't think there's any way it couldn't have been rigged.
Where did the trial occur? In the North or in the South?
I believe it was in Washington, D.C.
That would still technically be the South, because it's in Virginia.
Well, no, Maryland stayed. No, Washington's in Maryland. Well, it's in the D.C. is surrounded by, basically Maryland. And, that was the funny thing is you can drive from the capital of the United States to the capital of the Confederate States in less than an hour. You just think that maybe the Confederates should have put their capital a little further south. At least Chattanooga, a little bit harder to get to.
Yeah.
Anyway, where are we at now? Okay. So these four are put on trial, and I've heard a lot of stuff about the trial, and I can't ascertain to how bad it was, but essentially, four people. Okay, there's Lewis Payne / Powell, who had tried to kill the Secretary of State. Him, David Harold, David Atzerodt, and John Atzerodt. I don't know time with it. And Mary Surratt, who is an interesting one because she ran a tavern and a boarding house, which is where Booth and all these people met. Her son was John Surratt, who was involved, might have been involved with Confederate secret work. But there's absolutely nothing to implicate her. It was just her, as they said, hers was the nest that hatched the egg. And on the basis of that, she was hung, as were all of them. And they all, I think it was Lewis Payne, as he was about to be hung, shouted out, "I'm guilty, but Mrs. Surratt is quite innocent." Damn. They were doing that all the way to the last minute. So they hung them, and there was a lot of talk over what goes on here. Now, the other, in about the 1950s, a guy named Eisenschimmel, a chemical engineer, and he one day has this lightning bolt, hits him, chemical chemist, geochemist, I don't know what the hell he was. He was something chemistry. Anyway, this where it occurs to him that who had the most to win from the most involved thing for the death of Lincoln, and because he'd been a fan of that, kind of a student of it, and he comes up with his conclusion that actually Stanton, the Secretary of State, had Lincoln killed in order so that Stanton's people could maintain control over the government.
This is the Stanton character I was talking about earlier, right?
Yeah, right. He's the Secretary of State.
Yeah, and if everybody else had been assassinated, wouldn't he have been bumped up to being the president at that point?
No, I don't know the exact details.
The Secretary of State is the third person in power.
No, he's not the third person. He's actually like the 11th.
Damn.
But it might have been different back then. See, because that was, what was his name? General Haig, who got in so much trouble when Reagan had been shot.
Well, you got to keep in mind there were not that many offices during that period.
That's true. That's true. Housing and urban development was not yet a cabinet level position. But he comes to this conclusion, and this again gets tied in with a lot of the anti-Catholic people. Again, jumping in on this, and anyway, so that was basically his theory, that Booth was a tool used by, or this is when you start getting the idea it wasn't actually Booth who did it. Mm-hmm. There was another man, Captain Boyd, Captain John Ward Boyd, who happened to have not only the same initials as John Wilkes Booth, but they both had them tattooed on their hand.
Oh,
too.
Wow.
Unfortunately, that was about the only thing they had in common. They did different colored eyes, different colored hair. Boyd was about 30 years older than Booth. So there's not much thing on that, but there's on the idea that Booth, a couple guys over the years have claimed to be Booth, basically as one way to get a free drink out of someone, I would imagine. But so that the Eisenschimmel Grand Conspiracy, which is the idea that Ed Stanton, Stanton's Secretary of War? I forget. Seward Secretary? I'm so confused there. I'm sorry, I forgot who the team of rivals was.
It was Seward and Stanton. They want to take down Lincoln. That's
no. Seward was beyond Lincoln's. Was the guy behind him?
Yeah.
Yeah. Stanton was the guy who they say was trying to kill him, even though. Mm-hmm. There's a very interesting letter that comes out of this. It's said to have been written by Lafayette C. Baker, who was one of the many people who headed organizations that they called the Union Intelligence Service, or the Federal Detective Service at that time. Different groups that handled different bits of intelligence for the Union at different times. Alan Pinkerton was somewhat involved with that also. They were kind of rival organizations. But Lafayette C. Baker, he led the group that caught Booth. And there's a really wonderful letter, I wish I had it in front of me, which is supposedly written, where he talks about, in New Rome there walked 3 men, a Judas, a Brutus, and a spy. And he maintained, and as he goes on, the Brutus was Booth. He even supposedly yelled the line, Sic Semper Tyrannis, which is from, what do you call Julius Caesar, playing the part of Brutus to kill Julius Caesar. So he was the Brutus. The Judas was Stanton, because he betrayed Lincoln, and the spy was Lafayette Baker. And there's some great speculation on this stuff, but not a lot to back it up. Again, most likely you'd see what might have started off as a plot to kidnap Lincoln with maybe some official Confederate support or support from somebody claiming to be, and then degenerating into the simple conspiracy. 1 assassination, 2 bungled assassinations, and all the rest of that.
Well, while we're on the subject, we probably should cover the original article we said we were going to do.
Okay, yeah, if you want to do that while we're
here. Yeah, just to finish this up.
Since I've gone long-winded long enough. Once again, I can't wait till I can get a few days heads up on these, so I can actually refresh and get the details. Sorry, the studio that we're living in, that we're recording in, we're also living in right now.
Yeah, kind of.
Yep.
Let's see. 1. Booth initially planned to kidnap Lincoln.
Yeah, we discussed that.
Yes. After meeting with Confederate spies in the summer of 1864, Booth spearheaded a plot to abduct Lincoln, bring him to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, and use him as a bargaining chip to secure the release of rebel prisoners.
And like I said before, Washington and Richmond were quite close. If you could avoid the armies between them.
On March 17, 1865, Booth and his fellow conspirators hid along the country road in Washington, D.C., intending to commandeer the presidential carriage that was scheduled to carry Lincoln to a matinee performance of a play at Campbell Hospital to benefit wounded soldiers. Lincoln, however, had a change of plans and never showed. Booth soon had a change of plans as well. After the fall of Richmond and Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, he decided to kill rather than kidnap Lincoln. Number 2, Ulysses S. Grant was originally scheduled to be at Lincoln's side. This is one we did not discuss, actually.
Oh, yeah, him and his wife were originally supposed to be with Lincoln that night. But, I don't know the reason, but Grant bailed out.
Let's see if it mentions it in the article.
Yeah, he was replaced by Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Laura, was his wife?
Yes, I believe so. Just days after accepting Lee's surrender, the Union general accepted Lincoln's invitation to attend Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater on the evening of April 14, 1865. The general's wife, however, had recently been the victim of Mary Todd Lincoln's acid tongue and wanted no part of a night on the town with the First Lady. Grant backed out, citing the couple's desire to travel to New Jersey to see their children. Lincoln had a surprisingly difficult time finding a replacement. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Speaker of the House Schuyler Colfax, and even son Robert Todd Lincoln turned down the tickets before Clara Harris, daughter of New York Senator Ira Harris, and her fiancé, Major Henry Rathbone, accepted. Okay, so what do you think about that information?
Interesting.
That Mary Todd Lincoln had a very sharp tongue.
Let me tell you a little other bit of Lincoln thing. Robert Todd Lincoln, when he died, his wife did not allow him to be buried in the Lincoln family tomb. Because she wanted to be buried with him, and she was not going to spend all eternity right next to Mary Lincoln.
Oh, damn.
That Mary Lincoln was apparently a very mean lady, and apparently was accused of becoming mentally unstable after the death of her husband. But either way, she was cantankerous from the get-go.
Well, it seems like she would have started going mentally unstable when the first son died, wouldn't it?
Well, there's a chance that you could make that statement, but I don't know. I mean, she certainly, at this point, she was, they held seances in the White House and this type of thing to try and
the fact that they accepted originally and then they backed out points to the idea that she kind of just had a sudden break.
No, you're talking about Grant's wife there, because she accepted and they backed out. Well, no, she hadn't seen her husband for months. Fighting the war, man. I mean,